Hi, I'm Taylor.
And I'm Allison.
And you're listening to
the Conscious Health Podcast. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Conscious Health Podcast. On this week's episode, we will be discussing Canada's food guide.
Yeah, so recently it was changed. Well, I guess not so recently. It seems recently, but January 2019.
Yes.
Long awaited. It was 12 years, I think, since the last one.
The last one, I think, was 2007, right?
Yeah.
So it's been a while.
Yeah, they finally cut ties with the food industry.
There were some huge changes on this one compared to the previous guide.
And even how it's laid out, how it looks, it's completely different than any of the other food guides, because looking at the food guide, all the older versions come up. It's pretty interesting to look at them all.
It is. It's honestly wild. Like, some of the ones that they first came out with, you could see that various industries had huge impact on it, like the dairy industry. I mean, even that though has carried throughout the years. I think this year, or the one that came out this year is the first one that doesn't have massive ties to certain industries.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because it's kind of subtle. So before it was heavily, 2 glasses of milk a day. That's heavily funded and heavily it's in their best interest, I guess. So it was really the food industry that was driving some of those recommendations. Also, I took a pretty in-depth look at the 2007 one, and I noticed how it was fundamentally pretty similar. It was just kind of the way it was translated. And then it seemed like the whole food guide, the rainbow, the pictures, the icons, they didn't really match what was recommended in the written out guide. Just an example of that, it talks about having meat alternatives such as beans, lentils, and tofu often, which is kind of similar to what they say now is focus on plant-based proteins. Select lean meat and alternatives prepared with little to no fat or salt. Drink water regularly. These are all it's the same pretty much. It's just slightly tweaked. I was actually surprised about how similar it seemed. And whole grains and stuff. It's just maybe shifted a little bit. And of course they got rid of the milk and alternatives and meat and alternatives.
Right.
So that's a huge difference. They're kind of lumped together now.
One of the big changes kind of going along with that was changing the wording that was on the food guide. Because before, you were saying, it was meat and alternatives or milk and alternatives, and things like tofu and beans, legumes, things like that, or plant-based proteins were all kind of lumped as an alternative. Whereas now it's looked at as an actual protein source. Whereas before, I feel even though it was technically under the meat and alternatives, which people would assume would be protein, I feel the guide wasn't giving that message, getting that message across. You know?
Do you think it puts it on a even level playing field now? It's kind of okay, you have these options. It's not an alternative. It is a protein source.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that they've definitely kind of done that. And that, I think, was one of the huge changes, compared to previous food guides versus this one, was kind of changing that wording and changing the mindset that people have towards plant-based proteins, because now people would actually recognize it as an actual protein source. Of course, there's always been protein in tofu and beans, but I don't think that message was kind of given to people.
I think the translation of the 2007 guide was just not very well done. Fundamentally it's the same, and the science hasn't changed. We talked about this in a previous podcast, so the guidelines should be pretty similar.
And I know you mentioned earlier, how they used to have the rainbow and now it's a plate. And I feel that kind of makes it more of a guide as opposed to, telling us what to eat exactly. Just because the previous food guide, there was, the rainbow, and then within the rainbow there was, different servings.
Yeah, it's
serving
kind
amounts.
Of vague. Because it's eat these foods. And then you look at your plate, and your plate doesn't look like a rainbow with specific foods.
Right. But I think now that it's a plate and there's no actual amounts, I feel that can be a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah, it's got its pros and cons.
Obviously, it's good in terms of promoting enjoying to eat and kind of a whole foods, plant-based type of diet. But at the same time, I feel like some people would prefer to have more structure or more guidelines, at least, kind of telling them a little bit more what to eat. But then also you have to remember it is a guide, right? So it's like supposed to be just like general rules in a way that you would follow, as opposed to being like, okay, at every meal you have to have 2 servings of fruit, 2 servings of vegetables, 1 meat alternative, as opposed to like that was more like the 2007 one, whereas now the 2019 one, it's a lot more of a general guide.
Yeah, like you said, it has its downfalls. And also, I think, I'm not sure if it's come out yet, but they have recipes, they have other documents too to support that.
Yeah, I was actually taking a look at some of those documents, and they, all the like kind of general points and ideas that they were trying to get across. So things like, cooking more at home or eating with other people, which, just to note, that is like a new thing for the 2019 food guide, because I think before that wasn't emphasized as much.
No, it was almost completely focused on food.
On food itself, yep. So now they do promote things like eating with other people and cooking your own food, and they actually, and like using plant-based proteins as well. And they actually do provide you with other documents, like they have different recipes that you could do. They have different suggestions as to how to incorporate more home cooking, how to eat with other people, different things like that. So there definitely are more resources beyond just the plate itself. Because if you are looking at the plate, like, that will only tell you so much.
Yeah, it's kind of the quick and dirty,
Yeah.
This is it. And it's simple and it's easy to translate. It's just one picture. But yeah, I definitely see your point.
Now that they're moving away from kind of like industry funded, or maybe not funded, but at least like certain industries backing them, they're focusing more now on like macro and micronutrients as opposed to food groups. But one thing that they don't actually mention, which the 2007 guide did, was like supplementing vitamin D, also something that's really important.
I did want to talk more about the recommendations on how to eat and not just what to eat. So you mentioned cooking often, eating with people, and then take time to eat, and then being mindful around food, listening to hunger cues. Another thing they touched on was to cook more often and to teach children how to cook.
Wow.
And I think that's so important. And one thing I'm hoping with this food guide and how it emphasizes cooking, I'm hoping that it kind of pushes the schools to implement more cooking, because I was actually listening to another podcast and they were talking about the food guide, and they were saying how little food literacy and cooking knowledge that kids have. But before, like, our parents and our grandparents grew up with having home ec. Everyone had to do it, and you had like a home ec book with all these recipes in it. And there's people apparently that still use these recipes to this day. They'll pull out their home ec book and they still use it. But that's such an essential key skill. I mean, I love school. I'm assuming you do too. But how much have you used, like, I'm just going to throw one out there. No hate towards geography, but like, what have you used geography?
Nothing.
How much could you have used some cooking skills?
Yeah.
I just think it's so important.
I'm hoping that this guide does kind of change how teachers teach about healthy eating and food, because it's really important to understand at a young age.
Make connections with food too, like cultural, traditional, all these things. Food is a huge component of our lives, and when kids are kind of disconnected from that and they just, get served this meal or they order out and it just comes to them, there's no connection.
Right. And kind of going off of what you said about the food literacy, something else that this guide does talk about that the previous guide did not was actually looking at food labels and kind of understanding what's going on
and like, marketing.
I think is really important, and I'm glad that they're kind of making people aware that, like, things can be marketed as like healthy, or like it says vegan and everyone's like, wow, must be healthy. But then you look at the ingredients and it's a ton of extra sugar or different preservatives, so many different ingredients, and it's marketed as healthy, or it has like a little green leaf on it and people are like, oh wow, must be healthy.
It's funny that you say that you liked it, because I think it's important too, but the criticism is that it's kind of nuanced. It's like, watch out for marketing, but how do you do that? I don't think people understand. My mom will come to me and she'll be like, oh, it says this on the front, and I just say, look at the ingredients.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what it says on the front. Just look at the ingredients.
Yeah, that's what I do too. Like, I grab something off the shelf at the grocery store. Like, my first instinct is I look at the ingredient list.
Yep, same.
But I feel like for most people, it would be the marketing that gets to them.
Yeah, it's the first thing they see.
They see some packaging, you know, it's green, it has leaves, it looks natural, and they're like, oh, healthy, this and that. And people are sold on it, right? They're like, it must be healthy. Like, why would there be fake marketing? And, like, obviously you can't advertise products to be something that they aren't.
Yeah,
but
it's
at
not
the
fake, but it's stretched.
Yeah, like at the same time, there's definitely ways to kind of give the idea that it's something that it isn't. So I think that as well could be something that could be implemented into, like, you know, elementary schools and things, like, so students can learn at a young age how to look out for all these different marketing schemes. Like, I don't know
like
if that's the right word, but
like decipher social media and marketing. Yeah. And another thing, like, that kind of brings me to this whole marketing. They tell you to watch out for it, but then what's on TV?
Exactly.
Who's allowing that? That is the government who is allowing all that. So is it on us? Is it on them? Kind of brings up that conversation, which is a entirely different conversation.
Yeah.
But I think it brings up an important point, and that's kind of where the criticism comes from for that specific recommendation.
And it's definitely not black and white, you know, there are gray areas. So I think it's hard for something like that to tell the general public to be aware of marketing, but at the same time, there's not exact guidelines. They can't be like, oh, if you see this in an advertisement, like, that's not real. Like, so I think it's hard.
I think it's definitely something that would have to be implemented into education. But that's where the guide is used too, in these government places like schools, daycares, care homes. Those are where they're primarily going to be used, and it does influence policy. So, I mean, we can hope for the best. I'm sure as we go forward, it'll just keep leading to more positive changes in the food world.
Hopefully. Something else that is kind of also another, like, big thing of criticism towards this food guide was the idea of, like, accessibility. This food guide does promote, you know, eating, like, fresh fruits and vegetables, which obviously is not always going to be completely accessible to everyone. So what are your thoughts on that?
I have an entire list of thoughts, and there's so many aspects to it. So the fruits and vegetables. There was actually a study done, and it was Dalhousie University and the University of Guelph. It was called Canada's Food Guide: Awareness, Understanding, Affordability, and Barriers to Adoption. So they looked at quite a few factors, actually. Yeah, they surveyed, I think, 1,000-something Canadians. So they found that 25% of Canadians thought the food guide was unaffordable. But then in the second part of the study, they showed that a family of 4 would actually save an average of 6.8% on their annual grocery bill, which is like $1.90 a day.
Okay.
So people thought it was more expensive, but realistically it actually isn't. But there is one stipulation, and it's that gap is closing, because as we focus more on these fruits and vegetables and plant-based proteins, the demand for them grows.
Right.
And currently in Canada, I guess, and clearly internationally, the production of those products isn't great enough to sustain that. So it would drive the cost up quite substantially. It would end up, I'm assuming in the nearer future, that it wouldn't be as cost effective.
So kind of like a double-edged sword. Is that
it
what people
is,
say?
yeah. It's like, focus on this and it'll be more cost effective. But then the more you do, the less cost effective it's going to get. And also science and research. There's so much that goes into it, but that was considering that no food was wasted. So I looked it up after about food waste. 58% of all food in Canada is wasted.
Yeah, we waste a huge amount of food.
So,
it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it's like at all levels too. Like it's, you know, industry, but then even within people's homes and things like that.
Even at the farm, I didn't realize this. When the crop has no economical value, then they leave it there to rot in the field. So it's at every single level.
It is. It's true. And that's like a conversation for another podcast. But we have like a huge, huge problem with food waste.
But I thought that was kind of interesting that I guess it would save you at this point.
Like at this point, yeah. Yeah, no, I think people look at it and they're like, oh, fruits and vegetables and eating, plant-based diet, it's so expensive. And to be fair, it can be expensive. Like if you're buying, all these fancy like plant-based protein sources, like
Yeah, it
veggie
depends what
burgers
you're
and
eating.
things like that. And, but also like you can, for example, like fruits and veggies, you can get frozen fruits and veggies. And like, I don't know, someone might be like, oh, there's not as much like nutritional value in it. And
They're
like,
actually supposed to be more because they're frozen at peak ripeness.
yeah, like for most fruits and veggies, like freezing them, people do that as a form of making it last longer so that all of the nutrients will stay in the plant. That can be cheaper than buying fresh fruits and veggies. You can get like a bag of frozen veggies and it's so cheap, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, it would be more expensive to buy, fresh fruits and vegetables.
Also, you can do canned.
Yeah, no, so you do have like different options, frozen, canned, and buying, things like beans and legumes, it's very cheap. But I think people kind of forget sometimes, they're used to buying like meat, which obviously meat is more expensive. And then they think all of a sudden they have to buy all these like fancy alternative products, which to be fair, those are more expensive, but you don't need those. Another point about the food guide and whether or not it's accessible for people to get these ingredients is food security. One of the things I was looking into was how, while yes, it may be, cheaper right now at least, maybe not in like 20 years or so, but right now it would be cheaper to kind of adopt the methods of the food guide. People who don't have food security would probably be purchasing foods that are very calorically dense.
Well, I guess I know a little bit about the food insecurity in Canada. So let's say northern communities, inner city, if their closest grocer, or maybe it's a convenience store, there probably isn't going to be quinoa.
No. Even like fruits and vegetables.
Fresh
for
fruits
northern
and vegetables,
communities,
yeah.
like that has to be shipped to them. So odds are that they're going to be consuming things that are calorically dense. But some people might not have the option. I don't know.
Yeah, they might not have the access. They might not have the knowledge about food and how to even cook these types of foods. There's so much. I think it's great what they're promoting. It is really great. But it brings about these issues that we have in Canadian culture and, in education and government. And I think it'll lead to changes in policy, but yeah, it really brings up these issues because in the north, like I found an article and 55% struggle with food insecurity, and this same basket, like in order for them to attain this diet, it would be $1,900 a month.
That is crazy.
Yeah, because it has to be flown in. Like food security does not exist there.
No.
I don't feel good about something being promoted that isn't accessible to all Canadians. That's probably the biggest thing that bothers me about it.
And I think as well, going off of that, is while it is a guide and it is like meant to be very general, communities very far up north in Canada, they don't have food security, but it doesn't really follow their cultural traditions.
I did hear that they would have an Indigenous food guide. And the food guide has also brought to light living standards, policy regarding wages, and also, like I mentioned earlier, education around food, education around nutrition and wellness, and even building traditions. That's one thing I feel like as North Americans as a whole, we don't have a lot of food traditions. Unless you're of a different culture, then you bring those cultural traditions in. But it would be really nice to build that. It's more in line with Europe and Brazil, who have wonderful food guides. I'm pretty happy with it. There's always going to be some tweaks. And I've kind of touched on some of the points, but do you think these revisions to the guidelines would cause effective change in the way Canadians eat, like on a daily basis?
I think like yes and no. It really depends. I think one of the biggest things though would be education and like starting from a young age. Like I think that that would make, personally, I think that would make the biggest impact in terms of like changing our eating habits like as a country. Would be to educate. So hopefully this guide kind of pushes people in the right direction in terms of like teaching younger kids, how to eat and good like practices around eating. But I really do think that it starts like at a young age. For example, if you take someone who's older and they're used to eating a certain way their entire life, like odds are they're not going to be doing a whole like 180 on their lifestyle and diet, right?
Yeah, it's hard.
So I really do think that it starts young. So if we were able to properly educate in schools, then I think that would make the biggest difference, and that would probably have the like largest impact in terms of changing our eating habits and being able to actually like implement these different changes.
Yeah, I completely agree. Because I don't think anyone goes home after a day of work and takes a look at the food guide to see what they're going to make for dinner. Maybe some people do use it a lot, but I think, like you're saying, it's mainly education, because this is what kids are learning about what to eat, how to eat, and what's healthy, what's not. I think it's those government places like hospitals, schools, long-term care homes that it will make a big impact daily.
Yeah.
But then at least it should change policy. I think that's where we'll see the biggest changes, policy. And then 10 years from now, I hope kids are eating exactly how they say to be eating. That would be great. But yeah, I think it evolves with Canadians. It evolves with culture. The science does not really change. So it's basically the political and economical environment that's what will drive the next recommendations. And all we can hope for is that we educate our youth and they make the good changes, which I think they will. I'm pretty optimistic about that.
I hope so, because I find sometimes it can be tricky, like if their parents are eating one way and, you know, they're learning something at school, but how can a 6-year-old implement that, right?
Yeah.
Their parents are going to be cooking for them, buying their groceries, you know, making their lunches for school, so...
Yeah, they can't implement that, but I think when they have a base knowledge, then that really can catapult them into adulthood with good values and ideas around food.
It's super interesting, and it's cool to see how the food guide has evolved over the years. And I mean, I guess in a way it's always been somewhat similar, but each time there's like a new food guide that comes out, there's always like some revisions that have been done to it, and you know, it looks pretty different. And I think this one's had the biggest change of them all, right? A completely different setup in terms of like the plate versus the rainbow. It's no longer so segregated between the different food groups, you know, it's more enjoy your food, and also suggesting different ways to implement healthy practices around eating, whether that be enjoying your food, eating with others, cooking at home.
Yeah, completely holistic point of view, which is really refreshing.
I personally really like this food guide. Like, obviously, it does have some issues, but I think it's hard to make a food guide that can satisfy everyone, right? Like, it is a guide, and they're trying their best to make it somewhat applicable to every Canadian, right? So, and I think that's a really tricky thing to do, because diet, nutrition, it can be so personalized that it's hard to be like this massive umbrella that everyone's supposed to fall under it, right? But I think they've definitely made some changes in the right direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this food guide will bring a lot of positive change. Okay, well, that was a fun episode.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this week's episode as well. All right, so I guess that concludes our podcast for this week. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can stay tuned for more episodes.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.